final winter of World War II was among the coldest in memory, and not only for those trapped in the snows of the Eastern Front. It was a season of silence and suspicion, when even victory felt fragile. In early 1945, as Soviet forces advanced relentlessly toward Berlin, British intelligence began intercepting unusual Soviet radio transmissions, encrypted, irregular, and far more personal in tone than the usual field orders. What they discovered would open one of the most mysterious intelligence cases of the war, the so-called secret letters of Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The intercepts were first logged by British WWII service operators at an outpost in Cheltenham, later analysed at Bletchley Park under the supervision of cryptanalyst Hugh Alexander. The transmissions originated near the Vistula River front, coded strings sent on frequencies usually reserved for internal Red Army communications. What caught analysts' attention wasn't the encryption, it was the phrasing. The messages were written in a rhythm that resembled letters rather than operational signals. One operative reportedly noted, "These are not orders, they are confessions." By January 1945, Zhukov's first Belarusian front had crossed the Vistula and was preparing for the massive assault on Berlin. His armies, numbering more than 2 million men, were the spearhead of Stalin's final push into Germany. But within that enormous machinery of war, there were fractures, rivalries among generals, fear of the NKVD's watchful eyes, and exhaustion from years of relentless fighting. The letters, according to intercepted fragments, revealed glimpses of a commander privately wrestling with both the cost of victory and his growing distrust of Stalin's political motives. In one partially translated message, the sender, believed to be Zhukov, wrote, "They ask for victory, not truth. Yet without truth, what kind of victory will it be?" The line, though never verified, was enough to send a tremor through British intelligence. MI6's Section D, known for its covert operations in occupied Europe, was tasked with tracing the source. They called it Project Harrier, a mission to confirm whether the letters were authentic, and if so, what they might reveal about Soviet intentions in the final phase of the war. For the men at Bletchley Park, this wasn't just curiosity. The alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union was functional, not friendly. As the Red Army stormed eastward through Poland, the Allies already foresaw a post-war Europe divided by ideology. If Zhukov, Stalin's most celebrated general, was expressing doubts, or worse, dissent, that knowledge could become a geopolitical weapon. Meanwhile, on the ground, Soviet troops were crossing the Oder River under heavy German artillery fire. Villages burned, rivers froze, and soldiers moved forward through landscapes of ruin. Zhukov himself operated from a command post near Poznan, surrounded by maps, field telephones, and the dull thud of artillery echoing across the plains. Few could imagine the pressure he faced, to end the war quickly, to please Stalin, and to outmaneuver fellow generals like Ivan Konev, who also sought the glory of capturing Berlin. In private, Zhukov wrote in his diary, later recovered after the war, "We advanced not only against the enemy, but against time, fear, and suspicion." It was this human conflict, the collision between duty and conscience, that fascinated Western intelligence analysts. In the spring of 1945, British officers briefed Prime Minister Winston Churchill that certain communications from the Soviet High Command suggest discord of a political nature. No one dared draw conclusions. But for Churchill, wary of Stalin's promises regarding Eastern Europe, the implication was clear. The alliance of necessity was already crumbling. The intercepts stopped abruptly in late March 1945. The signal frequencies went silent, as if someone had deliberately shut them down. Some believed the NKVD had discovered the leak. Others suggested Zhukov himself had been warned and ended his correspondence. Yet within MI6, whispers circulated that one final transmission, never decrypted, had been intercepted just days before the Battle of Berlin began. Its codename in the archives was Message 1741B, a transmission never fully decoded and marked with a single word: personal. By then, the war's end was in sight. But for those in the quiet rooms of Bletchley and the dark corridors of MI6, a new kind of battle was beginning. Not of tanks and guns, but of secrets and silence. Behind every victory banner, there was another story unfolding. One written not in blood, but in ink, between the lines of coded letters and whispered doubts. The Allies would march into Berlin as victors. The Soviets would raise their flag over the Reichstag. Yet in the shadows of that triumph lingered a question no one could yet answer. What did Marshal Zhukov write, and why did he risk everything to send it? That question would haunt Western intelligence long after the guns of Europe fell silent. By February 1945, the world's most advanced codebreakers were working around the clock in a secluded English estate known only by its postal code, Bletchley Park. Inside its wooden huts, under dim lights and perpetual cigarette smoke, a team of cryptanalysts and linguists began unraveling the mysterious Soviet messages believed to be authored by Marshal Zhukov himself. For these men and women, decoding the Red Army's communications was never standard procedure. It was a dangerous gamble. The Soviet Union was an ally, not an enemy, yet the tone of these messages demanded attention. They hinted at divisions within the Soviet High Command, an invisible war of words that could alter the course of peace before the guns had even fallen silent. The transmissions traced to field posts near Warsaw and Königsberg, relayed through shortwave bursts. What confounded British analysts was the formality and restraint in Zhukov's phrasing. Unlike his famously blunt orders on the battlefield, these messages carried emotion, regret, anxiety, perhaps even guilt. One fragment read, "A victory without trust is a fortress built on sand." No one knew if this was genuine, propaganda, or a carefully crafted deception. But to those familiar with Soviet command politics, it sounded uncomfortably plausible. Bletchley's Section F coordinated with American counterparts from Arlington Hall, the US Army's Signal Intelligence Service. Joint decrypts were shared under the framework of the newly formed Ultra Agreement, though only a handful of officials had clearance to view the material. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Peter Calvert, who described the first analysis in a post-war memoir. The syntax was unmistakably Russian military, but the sentiment, that was personal, almost confessional. It was as if a man who carried an empire on his shoulders had begun to whisper under the weight. As Allied codebreakers worked, so too did their opposite numbers. German intelligence had long monitored Soviet communications, though with limited success. By early 1945, fragments of Zhukov's correspondence had also crossed German hands, confirming that these letters were real and not Allied fabrications. Abwehr files captured later in the war would reveal a chilling note dated February 12, 1945. Zhukov's morale uncertain. His loyalty appears absolute, yet his tone is weary. Stalin's shadow grows long over all. To understand this unease, one must step back to the volatile landscape of Soviet politics. Stalin trusted no one, not even his most successful general. The rivalry between Zhukov and NKVD chief Lavrenti Beria was well known, as was the dictator's paranoia toward those who achieved too much glory. British historian Alan Brooke later remarked in his diary, "Stalin fears Zhukov not because he might fail, but because he cannot." This tension bled through every intercepted message, a psychological front line as real as the one stretching across Poland. Amid this storm, American intelligence officers stationed in London proposed a new analysis. The letters might be part of a covert Soviet backchannel to the West. Some theorized Zhukov was attempting to communicate his doubts about Stalin's post-war plans, particularly regarding Poland, which the Soviets had promised free elections, but were already subjugating under communist rule. This theory gained traction when analysts noted references in the letters to shared burdens and unspoken debts, phrases interpreted as possible appeals to Allied conscience. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the First Belarusian Front continued its brutal advance. Between January and March 1945, Zhukov's forces liberated Warsaw and pushed deep into Pomerania, suffering immense casualties. The scale of destruction was staggering. Entire towns razed, bridges dynamited, rivers choked with debris and corpses. Soldiers slept in shell craters and fought for days without resupply. The deeper they advanced into Germany, the more surreal the war became. A vast machine grinding toward an exhausted conclusion. And within that machine, one man's private reflections suddenly felt like the only human voice left. In one of his recorded field orders, Zhukov wrote, "Every road we take is built from the bones of our own. The people deserve more than victory. They deserve peace." To Western ears, it was a startling admission. Yet to Soviet ears, such sentiment could be fatal. Stalin viewed empathy as weakness, hesitation as treason. The NKVD, ever watchful, monitored correspondence and courier routes with growing suspicion. Soon after, reports emerged of Zhukov's aides being interrogated and reassigned. As these developments reached London, the British Foreign Office became uneasy. The intelligence findings were too sensitive to share openly, yet too important to ignore. Prime Minister Churchill ordered that the documents be placed under special handling, accessible only to senior officers of MI6 and a select liaison in Washington. He famously commented to his chief of staff, "The Russians can hide their thoughts, but not their fears. Sometimes, that is more telling than any cipher." By the end of March 1945, a chilling pattern had emerged. The frequency of transmissions dropped sharply, then stopped altogether. The final message, received on March 29th, bore the cryptic phrase, "The river is crossed, but the bridge is gone." Analysts debated its meaning for decades, a metaphor perhaps for trust lost between allies, or a warning from a man already aware that his words had been overheard. For the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, it was both a triumph and a tragedy. They had glimpsed the human side of one of history's most formidable generals, only to lose him again in the fog of war. And as Germany's defences crumbled, another war, silent, invisible, and unacknowledged, had already begun. In the quiet rooms of intelligence headquarters, one question remained unanswered. Had Marshal Zhukov truly reached out to the West, or had his words been intercepted by those who wanted him silenced forever? Spring 1945. The war in Europe neared its end, but inside Soviet command posts, a quieter and far deadlier battle unfolded. One not fought with tanks or artillery, but with secrecy, loyalty, and fear. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, hero of Stalingrad and savior of Moscow, was leading his first Belarusian front toward the German capital. Yet behind his iron composure, something had changed. He was sending private messages, coded, deeply personal, that suggested the strain of command had given way to suspicion. And then suddenly the messages stopped. On March 31st, 1945, Colonel Anatoly Kovalenko, Zhukov's senior aide and personal courier, was reported missing somewhere between Frankfurt an der Oder and Kustrin. His convoy had been ambushed at night, according to Soviet dispatches, though no enemy presence was confirmed in the area. His vehicle was later found burned out, its driver executed with a single shot to the head. Of Kovalenko himself there was no trace. To the NKVD it was a security breach. To Western intelligence, it was confirmation that something far larger was unfolding inside the Soviet war machine. Kovalenko's duties placed him close to Zhukov's inner circle. He carried sealed correspondence between the Marshal and Stalin's general staff in Moscow, as well as, allegedly, personal letters meant for private archives. Western analysts had already tied his name to several intercepted messages now attributed to Zhukov. Some theorized that Kovalenko was the courier transmitting or drafting those letters. His disappearance, therefore, wasn't coincidence. It was erasure. Within days, the NKVD began a series of internal reviews inside Zhukov's staff. Dozens of officers were reassigned to secondary units or placed under administrative arrest, a euphemism for detention without trial. Stalin's paranoia had reached a fever pitch. He was convinced that foreign intelligence had infiltrated Soviet ranks. Beria, head of the NKVD, ordered that no unsanctioned messages leave frontline headquarters without direct oversight. For Zhukov, whose command relied on independence and rapid communication, it was a silent accusation, one that struck at his honor. According to post-war memoirs by Soviet officers, Zhukov reacted with fury. He demanded a formal investigation into Kovalenko's disappearance, stating, "My men are vanishing not in battle, but in silence. That is not war, that is fear." The comment was reportedly removed from official transcripts before being archived. Fear, indeed, had become a constant companion within Soviet command. Everyone knew that a word spoken in the wrong tone could mean exile, or worse. Meanwhile, across the channel, the disappearance of Kovalenko set off alarms inside MI6. Section D analysts recognized his name from previous intercepts linked to Project Harrier. They feared that if the NKVD had discovered the letters, their source, and Zhukov himself, could be in danger. A classified memo dated April 6, 1945, now partially declassified, reads, "Recommend immediate suspension of active intercept frequencies. Soviet internal security may now be aware of Western monitoring. The individual codenamed Horizon, believed to be Kovalenko, presumed compromised." But what truly happened to Kovalenko remains unclear. Soviet archives declassified in the 1990s reveal conflicting reports. One claims he was killed in an artillery bombardment. Another that he was arrested in Moscow weeks later under charges of disseminating private correspondence. Neither explanation fits the field evidence or timeline. Even Russian historians admit the record is curiously incomplete. For Zhukov, the timing was catastrophic. His armies were preparing for the final assault on Berlin, yet he now faced scrutiny from Stalin's inner circle. NKVD observers shadowed his movements, recording even his informal conversations with subordinates. Still, Zhukov pressed on, determined to deliver victory before politics destroyed him. On April 16th, he launched Operation Berlin, a massive offensive involving over 2.5 million troops and 6,000 tanks. The opening bombardment lit the sky from Kustrin to Silo Heights. Witnesses described it as a sunrise of fire, but victory carried its own price. During those desperate days, Zhukov's headquarters operated with minimal communication to Moscow, officially due to technical failures, unofficially because he no longer trusted who might be listening. Diaries from his subordinates describe him pacing, sleepless, muttering under his breath about betrayal. One aide recalled hearing him say, "We fight for them, and yet they fear us more than the Germans." The Allies, monitoring from the West, continued to gather scraps of Soviet radio chatter. Then, on April 20th, Bletchley Park received a final shortwave burst from the same Soviet frequency they had been tracking for months. It was only 14 words long, but it stunned analysts. "The courier is gone, truth buried under victory. The line will hold, for now." That was the last message ever attributed to Marshal Zhukov. After the war, Kovalenko's file disappeared from Soviet records. His family told only that he died heroically in the course of duty. Zhukov himself would never speak publicly of him again, yet colleagues later admitted that the Marshal often avoided questions about his missing aide. He carried that silence like a wound, one of his staff said years later. To Western intelligence, Kovalenko's disappearance marked the point when the mystery of Zhukov's letters turned from intrigue into tragedy. It confirmed that the words once whispered across radio waves had been silenced, not by enemy fire, but by fear from within. And as Berlin's ruins smoldered in May 1945, amid celebration and exhaustion, a darker story lay hidden beneath the Red Army's triumph. A story of a man who conquered Europe, but lost his freedom to speak. What, then, had those letters truly contained? The Allies would soon find fragments that might reveal the answer. Fragments buried not in Soviet archives, but in the ashes of a fallen empire. In late April 1945, Berlin was dying. The once mighty capital of the Third Reich had become a wasteland of smoke, shattered stone, and desperate resistance. Soviet artillery hammered the city day and night, reducing it to rubble as Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front advanced from the east. But while the Red Army fought its final, brutal campaign, a quieter discovery was taking place in the western sectors, one that would add another layer of intrigue to the mystery of Zhukov's secret letters. American intelligence units attached to Chef, the supreme headquarters. Allied Expeditionary Force were sweeping through captured German facilities, gathering any documentation that might aid post-war intelligence efforts. On April 27, 1945, near Magdeburg, a reconnaissance team from the US 83rd Infantry Division uncovered a half-burned cache of papers in the ruins of a former German communications bunker. The documents bore Soviet encryption headers and partial German translations. Among them, one phrase appeared repeatedly: "The heart of victory beats in silence." It matched wording from previously intercepted messages believed to be written by Zhukov. The find was immediately sent to the OSS station in Paris for analysis. Experts there determined that the fragments originated from German intelligence operations against Soviet field communications. Apparently the Abwehr, and later the SD, had managed to intercept, translate, and store parts of these transmissions before the Red Army's final advance. It was confirmation that Zhukov's letters had been real, and that even the enemy had known of their existence. What remained unclear was what they contained, and why they were so fiercely suppressed. Berlin itself was now a living inferno. Zhukov's men fought block by block, often at terrible cost. The Battle of the Silo Heights had already claimed tens of thousands of lives, and inside the city, the resistance was fanatical. German soldiers, Hitler Youth, and even old men fought from cellars and rooftops. Soviet T-34 tanks rolled down unter den Linden under continuous sniper fire. Each day, Zhukov's field headquarters moved closer to the front, where he personally oversaw artillery placements and infantry maneuvers. Yet those close to him noted that his demeanor had changed, colder, more withdrawn. The victory he had waited years for now carried a strange emptiness. On April 30th, 1945, the same day Adolf Hitler took his own life in his bunker, an OSS debriefing in Paris confirmed a direct link between the German intercepts and the British MI6 files from Project Harrier. The fragments matched the linguistic pattern of the earlier Bletchley Park decrypts almost word for word. Analysts concluded the messages had been authored by the same individual, likely Zhukov. Among the partial translations recovered was a particularly haunting line. "We advance through ruins, not to conquer, but to outlast the ghosts we have made." Whether the phrase was literal or poetic, it painted a portrait of a commander far more complex than the myth Stalin's propaganda machine had built. Western intelligence saw in these letters not treason, but humanity. The confessions of a man at war, not only with an enemy, but with the moral weight of his own nation's sacrifices. Still, not all agreed. Some OSS officers feared the documents were part of a Soviet disinformation operation, an effort to manipulate Allied perceptions in the final days of the war. Yet others, including American Intelligence Chief General William Donovan, ordered the material preserved for further study. In a private memo to Chef, Donovan wrote, "If authentic, these letters reveal a psychological fracture within the Soviet command that may shape the post-war balance of power." Back in Berlin, victory was near. Zhukov's forces had surrounded the Reichstag by May 1st. When his soldiers raised the red banner over the building, the image would become one of the most famous of the century, a symbol of triumph and endurance. But for Zhukov, the moment was tainted. In his personal notes, later declassified, he wrote, "There is no joy in victory, only the silence of those who will not return." Those who knew him said he lingered by his field radio that night, waiting for a message that never came, perhaps from Moscow, perhaps from a missing friend. By May 2nd, the German capital surrendered. The war in Europe was effectively over, but inside Allied intelligence circles, a new kind of battle had begun. One fought in vaults, archives, and interrogation rooms. American officers interrogated captured German signals analysts, hoping to trace the origin of Zhukov's messages. A Major Franz Reinecker claimed that his unit had handled transmissions from a high-level Soviet officer who spoke of truth, duty, and betrayal. When asked what happened to the original messages, Reinecker answered simply, "They were burned, like everything else that told the wrong kind of truth." The surviving fragments were flown to London in June 1945, labeled Operation Echo. Only a handful of officials ever read them in full. Among the readers was a young intelligence officer named Kim Philby, a man who, unknown to his superiors, was already passing information to the Soviets. Some historians later speculated that the Kremlin learned of the Allied possession of the letters through Philby's reports. Shortly after, Soviet authorities sealed Zhukov's wartime archives under Special Access Directive No. 47. The mystery was buried again, deeper this time, under layers of politics and fear. And yet, even buried truths have echoes. For the men who found those burned papers in a ruined bunker, the discovery raised haunting questions. If Zhukov's words were genuine, they revealed not just the strategy of war, but the solitude of command. A portrait of victory painted in secrecy. The Red Army had conquered Berlin. The war was over, but somewhere between the ruins of Germany and the locked vaults of Moscow, the meaning of those letters and the fate of their author's conscience remained unresolved. The guns of Europe had fallen silent by May 1945, but another war was beginning, one waged in quiet corridors, behind locked doors, and deep within the vaults of intelligence agencies. In the months following Germany's surrender, the Allies faced a delicate and unprecedented challenge: the handling of captured Soviet intelligence. Among these materials were fragments of Marshal Zhukov's secret letters, painstakingly recovered from burned German bunkers and decrypted radio intercepts. Their content suggested a man torn between loyalty, morality, and the heavy demands of history. And yet, the question lingered. Who had the right to reveal what Zhukov had written? And who had the power to suppress it? In London, MI6 placed the letters under special handling, an arrangement that ensured only senior officers could read them. The files were sealed in reinforced safes at Station Chowne, monitored around the clock. Prime Minister Churchill, aware of the potential political ramifications, insisted that the letters not be disclosed, fearing that their publication might disrupt the fragile post-war alliance with the Soviet Union. In Washington, General William Donovan's OSS officers took a similar approach, cataloguing the material as a potential bargaining tool while restricting access to prevent leaks. Yet despite the precautions, whispers of Zhukov's letters began circulating in intelligence circles. Some British operatives who had participated in Project Harrier quietly hinted that the communications revealed not just strategy, but personality, a private side of the Marshal rarely seen by friend or foe. They spoke of lines expressing regret over the cost of Soviet victories, fear of Stalin's reprisals, and a persistent sense of moral duty toward the soldiers under his command. To these men, the letters represented a human truth in a world otherwise dominated by propaganda. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, attempts to document or discuss Zhukov's private correspondence were swiftly quashed. Declassified NKVD files later revealed that researchers probing the general's archives were subjected to intense scrutiny, sometimes disappearing under mysterious circumstances. One report from 1947 notes, personnel conducting unauthorized examinations of Marshal Zhukov's private papers have been removed from assignment. Security measures intensified. Even Zhukov himself, now celebrated as the architect of victory over Berlin, maintained a strict silence on the matter. To the public, he was a hero. To those in the know, he was a man carrying secrets that could have endangered lives had they been revealed. Across the Atlantic, the American intelligence community debated what to do with the letters. Some suggested releasing sanitized excerpts to demonstrate Soviet humanity and open channels for post-war diplomacy. Others, wary of potential political fallout, argued for permanent classification. Lieutenant Colonel James Harwood, tasked with overseeing the recovered fragments, noted in his diary, "The words speak of courage, doubt, and conscience. Yet I fear that if they ever see the light of day, the delicate balance we maintain will be shattered." As 1946 unfolded, the Cold War's shadow began to take shape. The letters became more than historical artifacts. They were pieces of leverage in a growing geopolitical chess game. British and American intelligence quietly cross-referenced them against captured German documents and newly declassified Soviet reports. Every line, every fragment was examined for insight into Zhukov's personal beliefs, his relationship with Stalin, and the inner workings of the Soviet High Command. But the more they studied, the more questions emerged. Were the letters genuine? Had they been tampered with? Could their revelations alter the perceived morality of Soviet leadership? The human cost of these mysteries lingered as well. Surviving aides who had served Zhukov quietly spoke to historians years later of the pressure and fear surrounding the general in the war's final months. They described secret meetings, hurried dispatches, and the sudden disappearance of colleagues, men and women who had been responsible for maintaining operational security. One recalled, "It was as if the shadows were closing in around us. No one knew who to trust, not even among ourselves." Despite the obfuscation, some pieces of the letters eventually surfaced in scholarly research decades later. They suggested that Zhukov wrestled privately with questions of morality in wartime, the value of civilian life, the cost of obedience, and the silent weight of leadership. His reflections, though incomplete, offered a perspective on the human side of power rarely seen in military history. A general simultaneously celebrated as a hero and constrained by the very system he served. By the late 1940s, the letters had become a phantom of intelligence history, documented, yet untouchable, glimpsed, yet largely inaccessible. MI6 and the OSS continued to monitor Soviet communications for signs of similar correspondence, but the trail had gone cold. The fragments that survived were archived, referenced occasionally by historians with special clearance, and occasionally mentioned in memoirs by former operatives. They became evidence of a hidden narrative, a silent testament to the fact that even the most celebrated victories carried shadows that would not be illuminated for decades. And so, as Europe rebuilt and the world entered the nuclear age, Zhukov's secret letters remained locked in. Secrecy, a reminder that history is not only shaped by battles and treaties, but by the private choices of men and women who walk the delicate line between duty and conscience. They were whispers of truth buried under layers of politics, fear, and the enduring silence of those who survived to tell it. Yet the question persisted. What exactly did Zhukov write in those letters, and who truly held the key to their meaning? The fragments offered hints, but the full picture remained tantalizingly out of reach, a puzzle waiting for the courage of time to reveal its final shape. Decades had passed since the guns fell silent in Europe, yet the story of Marshal Zhukov's secret letters remained a shadow haunting military historians and intelligence archivists alike. In 1992, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, MI6 declassified a portion of its wartime dossiers. Among them was a file labeled Project Harrier, Zhukov Correspondence. For the first time in nearly 50 years, researchers could examine the evidence that had been hidden behind layers of secrecy, suspicion, and political expediency. The declassified file revealed fragmented translations, field notes, and even a few partially restored letters. Analysts confirmed that the documents contained reflections on strategy, but also deeply personal musings, moral dilemmas, concerns for the welfare of soldiers, and a rare candid critique of Stalin's political interference. One excerpt, partially reconstructed, read, "Victory is hollow if it costs the soul of those who fight. I bear their burden, yet I fear the consequences of truth." The line captured the very essence of what Western intelligence had sensed in 1945. A man bound by duty, yet troubled by conscience. Yet the letters did not answer all questions. Key sections were missing, lost either to war, destruction, or deliberate suppression. Historians noted that the disappearance of Colonel Anatoly Kovalenko, Zhukov's aide, remained unresolved, and other witnesses who might have verified the content were long dead. Even Soviet archives contained gaps, pages deliberately excised, annotations erased. The result was a puzzle, tantalizing and incomplete, offering glimpses into Zhukov's private thoughts without revealing the full narrative. The surviving letters suggested that Zhukov's final victory over Berlin was not only tactical, but also moral in nature. He navigated the treacherous terrain of Stalin's paranoia while striving to maintain some humanity for the men under his command. The documents implied that he understood the personal cost of triumph and perhaps even sought a subtle form of defiance, maintaining integrity in the face of absolute power. To intelligence officers and historians alike, this perspective added nuance to the heroic image projected by wartime propaganda. Further investigation revealed that some fragments had traveled beyond British and American archives. Scholars discovered that minor leaks had circulated in post-war European intelligence circles, generating curiosity and cautious speculation. Western operatives who had once worked on Project Harrier occasionally alluded to Zhukov's introspective tone, suggesting a man caught between the machinery of war and the imperatives of conscience. Those who had seen the letters often described them as a general's diary hidden in code, a record of internal conflict and personal morality within the Soviet command. Yet the letters continued to pose a paradox. Zhukov's public persona remained that of the unwavering commander who had led the Red Army to victory. The private writings, by contrast, revealed vulnerability, doubt, and the human cost of obedience to a tyrannical regime. Scholars noted that the contrast between the private and public Zhukov mirrored the broader tension between wartime myth and historical reality. A reminder that even figures of monumental power wrestled with fear, loyalty, and conscience. By the mid-1990s, historians began piecing together what could be reconstructed. Zhukov's letters suggested an unspoken narrative, a man who valued truth and human life, yet understood that full disclosure could imperil both. In this light, the loss of Kovalenko and the deliberate suppression of correspondence were not only acts of political necessity, but also evidence of the dangerous terrain within which even a celebrated general had to operate. The letters, incomplete as they were, became a testament to the moral complexity of wartime leadership. Ultimately, the story of Zhukov's secret letters remains one of World War II's enduring enigmas. They illuminate the human side of a man whose public achievements reshaped the course of history, while also reminding us that even the most powerful leaders carry private burdens, unseen and often unrecorded. Scholars continue to debate the authenticity of certain fragments, the motivations behind their suppression, and the ultimate fate of missing aides. Yet one truth endures. The letters offer a glimpse of conscience within war, a reminder that history is not only shaped by battles and borders, but by the private choices of men forced to reconcile duty with humanity. And so, as the archives remain partially open and fragments are carefully studied, the mystery persists. What Zhukov truly wrote, what he intended to convey to those beyond the front lines, and how it might have altered the understanding of the final months of the war, may never be fully known. Some questions, it seems, are destined to remain unanswered, a silent echo of the past, whispered across decades, from a general who conquered nations but carried his truths alone.